Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to episode number 98 of the White Knuckle Podcast, powered by Ozonics. Undetectable, undeniable. Hey, everybody, thanks for tuning back into the White Knuckle Podcast, episode number 98. Today's a tough day. As many of you probably already know, Todd was involved in an ATV accident on Saturday, and he lost control of his ATV at some point and subsequently landed in the ditch on some ice and fractured his skull. At this point, there's really not a lot to tell other than what you've seen on our White Knuckle page. We'll continue to update all of you as time goes on. As I said earlier in a post today on Sunday, what we need right now is prayers, because the fact of the matter is Todd's in for the fight of his life. So we struggled with whether or not to air a show today, because the show's with Don Higgins, who Todd absolutely admires and loves, and it was a tough choice whether or not to air the show under the sad news of what's happened to Todd. After talking with I guess all parties involved, we decided that it was best that it go on, because that's what Todd would have wanted. So we're going to air that show today. It's going to be episode number 2 in a series of 4 shows on habitat management. And not only is Don one of the co-owners of Real World Wildlife Products, he also is the owner of Higgins Outdoors. Don does some consulting, some land consulting. He did some land consulting for my soon-to-be boss. And Travis was super happy with what Don did for him, and thought there was a tremendous amount of value in what Don had to say, which obviously places him in a perfect position for this podcast. So do me a favor and keep those prayers going for Todd and the Pringnitz family and the White Knuckle family. Know that we're all pulling for Todd, and we appreciate every single prayer we get. So on with the show. Hey, everybody, welcome back to the White Knuckle Podcast. Tonight I am joined by Mr. Don Higgins. Don is probably most well-known recently for the 2 bucks you shot last year. In addition to that, you're a co-owner in Real World Wildlife Products, and then also in Higgins Outdoors. How's it going tonight, Don?
It's going good. How are you, Jason?
I'm doing well. First question that you recently wrote a blog on it, was how your success this year obviously didn't top last year, but tell us, I guess, if you would, just tell us a little bit about that for starters.
Well, I had a couple of nice bucks that I was after this year, but ironically, both bucks moved about the time they shed velvet. Well, at least one of them did. I had his picture up till September 5th. Got several of them over the summer, and he was a dandy. He had 14 points on one side, 9 on the other.
Oh, wow.
He would have hit the 200 mark for sure. But about the time he shed velvet, he relocated. And then something that I haven't put out there much was I was also, you heard of the world record buck that was shot in Edgar County, Illinois last fall.
Right.
I was actually hunting that buck.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
Oh wow!
I didn't put it out there. It was I got onto him through a friend last summer, and had trail camera pictures on the property I was on and everything from the previous year. But now I did not get a single picture of that buck, and Two different guys shared trail camera pictures with me, and guys that I really trust. And I mean, I've got the pictures in my possession. I know exactly where they were taken to the tree. And I ended up getting permission on those properties, leased them, and was after that buck. And there was actually 3 properties real close together that I was hunting for that buck, and I had cameras all over the place from July 1st through the fall, and apparently the buck moved. And, well, he definitely moved because where he was shot was miles away, but it's definitely the same buck. And you look at the trail camera pictures, I mean, it's him.
Oh,
he grew
wow.
a lot. He was probably 230 the year before. And then, he went to over 300. But, yeah, that's a story that I haven't put out there. Just, I never had my own trail camera pictures of the buck or laid eyes on him myself, so there really wasn't a whole lot to tell. But
Sure.
It was so I had some excitement until November 2nd when that buck got shot, just hoping that he would show back up. But that didn't happen. The other buck, he relocated. I did end up seeing 3 different bucks over 170 that I could have shot from a stand. 2 of those were 5.5-year-olds that I know very well that are still alive right now. Just checked 3 trail cameras today and had pictures of both those bucks on those cameras. So they'll be around next year. It'll be 6-year-olds that hopefully they add a few inches.
Yeah.
I don't think any of them have the potential to hit 200.
Okay.
But nice bucks nonetheless.
Well, that's a better year than I was able to put together. I spent most of the year chasing really my tail. I got a new lease in the southwest part of the state, which was I think it's close to 500 acres, and then but at the same time drew an Iowa tag. So I really, common sense would dictate that you're probably going to spend most of your time in Iowa, which I did. With Todd, he and I leased a piece together, and they just got just absolutely clobbered by EHD, and after about 4 days and running into the game warden, I sort of hit the ejection seat a few days later and came back up to my lease and was able to learn a little bit about that, but by and large didn't get to spend a whole lot of quality time there.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, well, as I said to you before we hit record here, we're going to devote February to habitat management and land management. And, as we all sit around and watch the snow fly, a lot of folks are thinking about what they can do next year to maybe change their outcome that they didn't get this year. And I guess the one question I want to start off with is, you look at a lot of pieces of property, and as a matter of fact, you've looked at some for some of my friends, and those properties range in size from 5 and 6 and 700 acres and more, all the way down to 40 and 80 acres. Do you try and manage those pieces of property different just based on the size alone?
Yeah, every property is unique, and size is one of the things that differentiates one property from another. But, the bigger the property, the more you can do with it. But at the same time, the bigger the property, the more the advantage of the buck, too, because if you've got 500 acres, it's all managed pretty much the same, then that buck's got 500 acres to hide on.
Right.
If you got 40 or 80 acres and you got a good buck staying on you, well, every time you hit the property, if he's bedded there, you're within a couple hundred yards of him or so. So, there's an advantage to smaller properties. There's advantage to bigger properties, but they're all different, So you just got to kind of take them one at a time.
When you're looking at like writing a plan or whatever it is that you do when you sort of give your final analysis of a property, let's talk about a smaller property, because that's probably going to be more likely. The folks that are listening to this are probably more likely to have a smaller piece of property. How much of your plan revolves around, the actual habitat management, and how much of it revolves around, I guess, manufacturing high odd, low impact situations, if that makes sense?
Well, again, every property is unique. For example, Saturday I was in Ohio looking at a property, and the cover on that property was absolutely fantastic. There was nothing that needed to be done to it. It was more managing the way it's being hunted and the approach that the landowner takes with it. But there's other properties where the landowner seems to be doing everything pretty much right, but the property hasn't been laid out to its best potential. So, you may have to move things around, move the food plots, create a little bit better bedding cover. You just never know. Again, every one is different. I've done, I don't know, over 100 properties now for folks, and there's no two plans that were the same.
Sure.
I guess the starting point for me is always, we got to get the deer staying on the property, because if you want to consistently kill mature bucks, you got to hunt them on the properties where they spend their daylight hours. And I tell my clients all the time, if you're just one property off from where a buck spends his daylight hours, your odds of killing him are about 10% of what they would be on the property where he beds. So the first thing we got to do is we got to get him bedded there. And, usually that involves manipulating the habitat to some degree to make sure he's got the bedding cover on the property.
Okay. How would you go about manipulating the habitat? I know it's going to be different, but if I could sort of set up a scenario for you, let's say that you've got 80 acres and 35 of that 80 or 40 of that 80 is tillable, and the rest is timber, and it's mixed timber, and you've got some good spots and you've got some bad spots. Do you try and convert all of that timber to habitat or bedding cover, or what is it that I guess how do you break that down, and what is it that you would do typically?
Well, I mean, it depends on how it lays out and the type of woods it is. I mean, if it's a mature woods, I may suggest that we go in and have it logged, get some income for the landowner, but also allow that sunlight in to reach the ground and thicken things up that way. There's just so many variables that it's hard for me to give a solid answer. It may sound like I'm ducking the question, but what you want as much bedding cover as you can get on that property. Especially with smaller properties, you want to utilize every square foot to your advantage, whether it be in cover or food. And the other thing I tell my clients is you need to think of your property as one square on a giant checkerboard of squares. If you was in an airplane 30,000 feet and you're looking down at your property, it's one little square on a giant checkerboard. So we got to give the deer every reason possible to want to spend as much time as possible on your little square. It needs to stand out from all the squares or properties around it. So that's kind of the approach I take.
What makes it stand out? Like, if you could give an example.
Well, the bedding cover can stand out. And, for example, I've noticed on my property that certain individual bucks will prefer to bed in the tall switchgrass fields or bedding grass fields, and other specific individual bucks will prefer the wooded cover. So if on the property you described, where there's 40 acres of woods and there's 40 acres of tillable, you don't need 40 acres of food in most situations. So, I would, depending on how it lays out. How it lays out to everything. Mm-hmm. Some of that could very well go into switchgrass or bedding grass. And if you're the only guy on the checkerboard who has switchgrass on your square, and one of those individual bucks comes along that loves to bed in the switchgrass, well, guess what? He's going to be on your place.
Sure.
So, and then the other way is through the food sources. I'm big on planting mass trees that, are not common in an area. So as we get a little bit into the upper Midwest, persimmon trees, for example, become less common. I'm kind of on the line where south of me there's a lot of persimmon trees, but north of me there's not too many, and the further north you go, there's even fewer. So if you are up there and you're not too far north where you get out of the range where persimmons will grow, and you plant groves of persimmon trees and they're located in the right places on your property, well, guess what? You're going to be the only guy on the checkerboard with persimmon trees on your place. And when they're in season, well, the deer are going to be there hammering them. And it can go on down the line, chestnuts, pears, apples, whatever. You want to diversify your food sources, and you want to make your property stand out from those around it.
Well, that makes complete sense. So I think what you're saying is, if you do look at it like a checkerboard, you want your place to stand out. Now, if you're habitat rich, well, then you need to. I think what you're saying is then you need to maybe concentrate on making yourself unique in terms of food, or just having the right food or enough food or whatever the case may be. Like you said, it's different for everyone. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and you need to look beyond your borders. A lot of times when I'm showing up at a client's to look at a property, before I get there, I may take a little drive around the section or whatever to look at the other properties in the area, because you want to address the weakest link in that area, not the weakest link on the property, but the weakest link in that whole neighborhood.
Okay. It sort of begs the question: what would constitute a weak link, or can you give an example?
Well, sure, yeah. If you're in like the heavily wooded, say, Northwoods of Wisconsin, food is probably going to be the ticket, because cover is everywhere.
Sure.
And then you get down in my area where the ag fields are huge and dominate the landscape. Cover is at a premium here, so cover is often the weakest link around my neck of the woods.
And that was actually a question that I wrote down, and you basically indirectly answered it. And the question that I'd written down is cover king, or is cover? I guess I think you answered the question. Cover isn't king if it's not supported by food. Correct?
Right. Cover is king in my area because there's so much food, but cover is not key in a lot of areas.
Let's ask just a listener submitted question, and that is, if they have a piece and they want to do a hinge cutting, how far from a food source should that hinge cutting be?
Well, everything comes down to the lay of the land, and
sure.
The neighboring pressure, hunting pressure on neighboring properties, which, by the way, is not a totally bad thing.
Right.
It helps differentiate your property from the others. If there's hunting pressure all around you and you've got a sanctuary, well, guess what? That hunting pressure is going to push those deer into your sanctuary. But the layout is just so critical. I mean, you got to keep those deer away from the other hunting pressure. And you don't want them bedded right up against your neighbor if he's going to be sitting the fence and hunting right over your bedding area. In the same way with food, you don't want to draw them out to the bad neighbor with food. So there's just so many factors. It's hard to really pin down because each property is individual.
Maybe a better way to state that question, and I was just reading it off the screen here. I think a better way to state that question is how far really is too far for a deer to travel for food? In other words, how far do you think that they will travel before they'll adjust their bedding to get closer to that food? If that, I think that's, yeah.
Well, if you're talking about a mature buck desires seclusion and freedom of human intrusion over anything else. And for him, he'll bed 2 miles from the food if he needs to. He'll just wait till it's dark and take off marching towards the food, and he'll be there and feed all night. But when the sun comes back up, he's going to have his head stuck in the brush where he's safe.
Right.
I don't like the bedding cover too close to the food, because if a deer gets hungry, it's that transition area between the two is where you can generally catch a mature buck and get a shot at him. To lay out a property for hunting, you want a little distance between the food and the prime bedding cover. But there's no hard and set rule, especially when it's mature bucks, that they want that security more than anything. But they also want to feed in the prime food sources. So
sure,
you don't want them a mile away under ideal conditions, but you don't want them right on top of it either. I'd say, within a quarter mile would be ideal.
How do you go, I guess, about manufacturing, or how would you go? And I know it depends on the lay of the land and those things. But how would you go about manufacturing what I referred to as a high odds, low impact stand? I'm assuming you're going to look at the best way to get in and get out without upsetting, the world around you, correct?
Absolutely. Access is everything. And if you don't have that good access, you don't have a good stand site, no matter what it overlooks. So you need to be able to get into your stands without disturbing your property. And that's where it really comes down to fine-tuning a plan for any individual property. Is it needs to be laid out in such a way that it can be hunted without putting undue pressure on it. And we see all the time in blog posts, magazine articles, or whatever about not burning out stands. But if your property is laid out right, you can hunt a stand a whole lot harder than you can if it's not, and get away with it without burning out that stand. And that's really the key to the custom plans that I put together. Is I want to put them together in such a way that those stands can be hunted with the high odds of seeing the buck you want to kill, but doing so, you're putting very, very little pressure on the property. Wind direction comes into play. I mean, when I lay out a plan, it's got the stands marked and everything else, but the wind direction is marked for each stand location on that map.
Okay. Makes sense. When you're talking with folks just at a trade show or whatever the case may be, what's the biggest mistake that you hear people making when it comes to trying to improve their habitat? Is it necessarily related to a certain act like hinge cutting and doing that the wrong way, or do you see more people making the mistake of over hunting a property wrong or hunting it the wrong way? Or
well, I think the biggest mistake is they overthink it and they overwork it. They just do too much work. That they don't leave anything undisturbed. Every acre of their property has something going on, and a big part of the reason for that is all the bad information that's out there through outdoor writers and on the internet and such, that these guys have thrown out the idea that you create this big buck merry-go-round, I call it, where you got a little food plot here, then you got a little bedding cover, then you got another food plot, and you got some screening and this and that, and it goes in a big circle. And the theory is the buck waltzes around your merry-go-round on your property, and you just set up your stand between these different features and you kill him. So I can't tell you how many properties I go to where there's these little micro plots every time you turn your head, and there's these little hinge cut areas and this and that. They overthink it, they overwork it, and in the process, they generally chase off the mature bucks.
Okay. I guess that makes sense, because I can think of a dozen examples where I've done that exact same thing. You just spend too much time doing too much, and too much ends up being not enough really to make a difference. Or in doing that, do you provide just too many options in spreading the deer out?
Well, what you do is you present too, or you put too much human pressure on the property.
I gotcha.
I mean, you're in there doing one thing or another, and it's like every square foot of the property has got something going on, and there needs to be large chunks of secure bedding cover that are undisturbed. I kind of jokingly tell people, I get asked all the time, do you create buck beds or doe beds or this and that? I said, no, I create buck motels. I let them pick their own bed. I want a big chunk of I want a big chunk of bedding cover. I don't care which tree he beds under. You just bed in there. I'll kill him when he comes out.
You're going to make that buck motel either, if I know you, like I think I do, you're going to make it by either bedding in a bag or something like that. I'm assuming you're going to use bedding in a bag. If that's the situation that you're in, or you're going to hinge cut it or something like that, or plant some sort of tree that's going to provide better bedding cover than what's there. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. And while we're at it, I probably ought to throw it out there that I want to trademark that buck motel quote, or somebody else grabs it and runs with it. I'm the guy that came up with the buck motel. I need to use that to sell something. But
yeah, exactly.
Somebody will grab that and run with it.
Yeah, it'll be on some TV show pretty quick.
Yeah.
One topic that we get a ton of questions on, and everybody seems to do because everybody's got a chainsaw and a gallon tank of gas, is hinge cutting. I guess, what are some common do's and don'ts?
Well, I'm not a huge fan of hinge cutting. Now, I do think it has its place, and I've done it on my property, and I will continue to do it on my property, but I think it's overdone on most properties. And most people go in, and from what I've seen, they just indiscriminately start chopping trees, and they don't know if they're cutting an oak, a maple, an ash, a hickory, or what it is. They're just waylaying trees. And I think we can be better stewards of the resource than doing such. I mean, selectively hinge cutting is a whole different thing and is a good thing.
Right.
Versus just going in and having a chainsaw massacre, so to speak. That
would be my buddy Todd.
I wish he was here.
We walked his piece last year as I was preparing to sort of get myself acclimated. In the spring we were shed hunting and trying to figure out how to access or how we were going to access certain areas, and I walked up on his hinge cutting and I said, "Did you do this?" And he said, yeah, why? I'm like, "Do you know how many nice oak trees you cut down?" And he said, "Yeah, I've been told that before," and he really regrets not studying it more. And is that when you're talking to people about stuff like hinge cutting, is the kind of tree that you're cutting as important as where you're cutting it?
Well, I think both are important. I think it's pretty important that we be good stewards of the land that's entrusted to us for a time. And my thing, for example, is killing big deer, as is Todd's. But I have no idea what the next generation, what their thing is going to be. So one day I hope to leave my property to my grandsons. And, maybe the timber production is something that interests them. And so for me to be out there indiscriminately cutting oak trees and walnut trees and trees with value, that not only affects me, but that's affecting generations to come. And I just think we need to be better stewards of the resource than that. And we can do so while still maximizing the deer hunting potential on that property. So, location of the hinge cut, that's important, but the tree species are important too. And there
Okay.
may be situations where the oaks are thick enough where they do need thinned, and it doesn't hurt to hinge cut a few of them. Again, it goes back to each situation is a little bit different. But if a guy has is out there and he can't identify one species from another, at the time of the year when the leaves are off and the hinge cutting's being done, then really he probably has no business doing it unless someone's there to mark trees or to help him.
Right. And that was another, the next question on the list is how important is it to know what one tree from the next? And is there a good resource for figuring that out? I'm sure there's 100 resources on the internet. Good Lord, you can find everything on the internet, except common sense in a lot of places. But, sorry, I just had to interject that. Is there a particular resource that you've used? I'm sure you know them by heart by now. But a lot of folks don't. I grew up, with my dad making me cut wood through the entire month of October, and I could never go hunting until November. But I got to learn what a cherry tree and an oak tree and a walnut tree and all that stuff was, and what they look like without their leaves on, etc. Is there a good resource that you could recommend that people go to prior to going out and just starting to whack down some 6-inch in diameter trees? Because there's really not a ton of difference, is there, between some of the younger trees when they're in their infantile stage?
Well, to answer your question, I don't know of a good resource. I'm sure they're out there, but I just know them by experience.
Sure.
I owned a tree nursery for a number of years where we grew trees. And I worked as a tree planting contractor, so I planted literally millions of trees. So
that would qualify you, yeah.
I mean, I can tell you a red oak from a white oak, from a black oak, from a pin oak, from a shingle oak, or whatever. It doesn't matter if it's in January or July.
Right.
Just experience. So I really don't know, though, the resource. I'm sure there is something out there.
We owe it to the resource to know what in the world we're doing prior to going out there and doing it. But, like I said earlier, the one reason that I wanted to ask about hinge cutting is I think there's just this misconception that going out and zipping off 40 trees in an area and hinge cutting them is going to create this, excellent bedding habitat. It may.
Right.
It also may cause a lot of damage in the future.
Yep.
Next question. How important or what kind of impact can the presence of water in a property that doesn't have water on it be? And let's assume that we're talking about a property that doesn't have water for a half mile.
Well, that's an interesting question, and I know that water is essential, but I had an experience, the buck I shot the last year that I called Trump. Probably remember that story, but Trump would spend the summer in a bachelor group in the middle of a section, an ag section, where I have not, and there's always a bachelor group out in this section every summer. It's nothing but corn and soybeans. I mean, it's just a sea of ag. And I don't know how I stumbled onto it, but years ago I discovered a bachelor group staying out there, and now every summer I move my trail cameras out there because they're always there. But the crazy thing is I cannot figure where them deer water because there is not water that I can find within a half a mile. Nowhere on that section is there water.
Really?
And it just, I've scratched my head for years over that situation because they're out there in the hottest part of the summer. There's both corn and soybeans in that section every summer, but there's no, I don't know where they're watering at, but yet the deer are always there. Day after day, they're there. I just get their pictures out there on a daily basis. So I have no idea if at night they go somewhere and there's a water hole I don't know about, or well, I've not been able to find it. And I've been out there when the crops are all gone and everything, and there's not a cattail or nothing. So to get back to your question, I'm not sure how important the water is.
It's something that that you see often, people putting baby pools on their property, and maybe that's a great idea for getting summer inventory or what have you. But I don't want anybody to quote me, but I know that deer are not like humans, and they don't need water every day or even every couple of days. They can. I think they can go for a relatively long period of time without having any water. I think they can ingest it maybe from crops and things of that nature. So that may be why the deer that you're seeing don't need it quite as badly. I'm not sure.
I suspected that. I suspected they was getting a lot of their the moisture they needed from the soybean leaves they eat. Because that's why they're out there in this section. A lot of times in the summer, the does will occupy the best habitat. That's where they're raising the fawns. And here in the farm country where I'm at, I found that those bachelor groups of bucks they'll live out in the ag fields, especially if there's like a grass waterway out through a soybean or cornfield. Those deer just love to travel those. Those are one of my favorite places to put trail cameras, is a grass waterway in the middle of a section where there ain't a tree around for half a mile. You get all kinds of pictures of giant bucks out there, and I suspect they get a lot of their moisture from those soybean leaves.
Gotcha. Yeah, that would stand to reason. And I suppose in an area like that, if on the right day, when you get a fresh rain, there may be just a short period of time where water pools up enough for them to get a drink. So basically, what you're saying is you're just not. That's not something that you're typically writing into a plan, is it?
I almost never. And you brought up the kiddie pools and the wading pools that people are putting out there. And there's so much garbage on the internet. I think there's a contest that I don't know about to come up with the craziest thing to attract deer to your property, because a lot of those projects you probably spook off more mature bucks than they ever attract. I mean, it's just plumb ridiculous. I mean, it's.
I can see one. Yeah, right. I can see a buck putting their hoof through one of those little plastic baby pools and scaring the living daylights out of it. Well, that sort of begs the next question that I was going to ask you, and it's something that I get asked a lot just because of Ted Miller, a guy that was on our team for a period of time. He was big into horizontal rubs, and he did it just simply because it was fun for him. And people always are private messaging me and asking, how important is a horizontal rub? And I'm going to ask a professional for the first time ever, how important is a horizontal rub?
Well, I've never made one in my life, so I have no idea. But it seems like you get on the internet anymore, and if you don't have a wading pool and a tree planted out in your food plot for the deer to rub on, that you're missing the boat. But I'm sure they work to some degree. But man, I'll tell you what, people just try to make it more complicated than it is. It's really killing mature bucks is pretty simple. I think what holds back a lot of people from success is the fact that they just simply try to make it too hard. They make it more difficult than it really is.
I agree. There's a lot of things, whether it's hunting or life in general, we often, as human beings, make things a whole lot more complicated than they need to be. Just to elaborate a little bit on the horizontal rub thing, Ted Miller did tell me not that long ago that he said, Jason, the horizontal rub is it's horizontal. That's all that makes it different. The most important component of that whole structure that Ted makes is the licking branch. And I think we could probably all identify with that. So. I know that food plots are near and dear to you to an extent. Let me just think of how to frame this question properly. I guess I'll just blurt it right out. Are food plots, in your opinion, a waste of time when there's just an absolute ton of ag? You know where I live. You've done some work up here. Are food plots a waste of time in areas like I live in where there's a bunch of cover and there's also a bunch of ag?
No, absolutely not, because the food plot is your opportunity to set your property apart. There may be tons of cornfields and soybean fields and whatever, but you can put something in your plot that there's not a lot of, something that's very limited. That's your opportunity to set your property apart from the properties around it.
So is there any one particular thing that you would recommend, or is it really a matter of what's available to the deer in the area?
Well, like I live in an area that it's agriculture everywhere. And
right.
Huge corn and soybean fields. But the thing of it is, like today in January, how many soybean fields are out there standing? A deer would have a hard time finding 3 soybeans, except in food plots. So a lot of times it's not the crop, but it's when that crop is available, which will really help set your property apart. Cornfields anymore, these combines have become so efficient, they don't leave much grain behind. Occasionally you'll get a situation where a windstorm or something will knock a lot of corn down, and maybe there's some spoilage that way, but for the most part, the combines are pretty efficient anymore, and there's not a whole lot of grain out there. But if you've got a cornfield plot and you go out there and bush hog it, and you've got corn everywhere, well, that really sets your property apart too. So it's not just the crop, it's when that crop is available.
Okay. That makes complete sense, because you're right. Just the advancements that have been made in that kind of ag equipment, even in the last 3 to 5 years, is just amazing. Mm-hmm. I notice it walking through the fields, out to the stand, etc. One other question that we had, and it's something that we talked about on a podcast that we did last year with one of the folks that sells a bunch of the real world wildlife product stuff. And that was, bedding in a bag. This person had 20 acres of timber on roughly 100 acres. And, they had a lot of the property in this particular case, not a lot, a section of the property they had just let grow up into grass. And, what I wanted to ask is, if it's grass, that's great. But if it's laying down in the middle of the winter, is it worthless?
Pretty much, yeah. It's not doing anything that time of the year anyway. Now, it might have provided some cover earlier in the summer. It might have been great for does raising fawns or whatever. Early fall, it might have hid some deer, but once it's flat to the ground, it's pretty much worthless to deer.
So what is it that you recommend then? Obviously, bedding in a bag, but what makes it that different than just grass that's laying down in the middle of winter?
Well, bedding in a bag is basically a blend of 3 different grasses: big blue stem, Indian grass, and switchgrass. But the real key to it is each of those 3 species, there's a dozen or 2 dozen different varieties. For example, there's 2 dozen varieties or more of switchgrass, and there's several varieties of Indian grass and several varieties of big blue stem. So, what we did was we got our hands on every variety within those species we could find, and then we selected the ones that stood the best and blended them to create the bedding in a bag. So, I know there's competing seed companies that have put together their own bedding mix using those same species, but the key is not the species. We use those species because they're taller grasses rather than some of the shorter grasses, but the real key is the specific variety.
Last question, and then I'll let you go, because I've taken 45 minutes of your time already. What's the best way for someone, if they're trying to do this on their own, to sort of prioritize what's most important? How would you go about doing that in terms of managing for habitat, improving the overall landscape, if you will?
Well, one of the first things I'd tell people is to forget half the crap you see on the internet, because everybody's got an idea, and most of the people with an idea have never killed a buck using the idea. So the key really is you got, if whatever you want to shoot, you've got to get it bedding on your property to have a real chance to do it consistently. Food plots get all the press, the publicity, but cover's where it's at. You got to have those deer bedding on you, and then once they're bedding on you, you can use the food to hold them and to create huntable patterns. But first of all, you got to get them bedded on you.
Well, there you have it, my interview with Mr. Don Higgins. Don, thanks for taking the time to do that podcast. Always a pleasure. Sorry Todd couldn't be here to do it, but perhaps next time. With that, I will begin closing out the show for today. Thanks again to all of our partners, particularly Real World Wildlife Products and their partnership with us. We're happy to be working with them again this year. And, of course, the folks that make this show possible, Ozonics. Thanks to them. Again, if you want any of the Ozonics products, just go to their website, www.ozonixhunting.com, and you'll be able to find whatever deals they've got going on. And it's also likely that they'll be at one of the sport shows in your area over the next month and a half. So with that, peace out.